Good evening. My name is Megan Maris. Welcome to my thesis presentation from Light Breath to Liberation, the evolution of the role of the breath and prana through the yoga traditions. I'd like to begin by first asking you, the audience, to take a moment to consider what, if anything, comes to mind when you hear the term prana. A few translations that we might hear today could be vital force, life force, subtle energy. Thank you. Throughout the master's program, it's been made clear to me that the term yoga cannot be distilled to a single definition. It has meant different things at different times and has had different aims depending upon the philosophical system which it's been embedded within. Whether that be the dualistic schools of Samkhya Yoga or the non-dualistic schools and its many tributaries. My curiosity piqued as I wondered if the same had been true for the term prana. Had it also meant different things at different times and had different aims depending upon the philosophical system it was embedded within? This presentation is an attempt to take a broad view of the role of the breath through yoga's history to have a better understanding of what is meant by the term prana. I employed two primary methods for my research. The first was to create a through line. I read many of the primary texts of the yoga tradition, as well as the secondary literature of the various scholars. My thesis advisor, Dr. Zoe, pointed out to me that in regards to the breath, scholars have focused on particular periods of time or within specific genres of texts. My thesis is an attempt to bridge the gaps within scholarship, to trace the story of the breath throughout yoga's history. The second aspect to my thesis is to identify the factors that were influencing the changes within the trends of yoga's philosophical thinking. This is important because philosophical ideas are formed within and influenced by the political, economic, social, cultural, and religious context in which they are situated within. If ideas are not applied to lived experience, they remain as philosophical pursuits. To effectuate social change, ideas have to be implemented into action. Thus, by establishing a clear view of the roles that breath and prana have played throughout the various philosophical systems of yoga, may provide insights for ways to go forward with the philosophy and application of the breath to meet the unique circumstances of our time. I'd like to point out just a few of the general characteristics of breath and prana that remain fairly consistent throughout their evolution. The terms are often used interchangeably. In the early Upanishadic era, the terms were combined and to form the compound life breath because it was a matter of observation. Those who were breathing were alive and those without breath were not. Thus, extending the breath meant extending life. In pre-modern yoga, typically anything before the 1800s, the breath was a central feature of physical practice. So as Dana just pointed out to us, even within the Hatha Yoga period, where physical practice expanded, the breath was still the primary and the principal technique. Breath control was viewed as a form of tapas or austerity. And many texts state that breath control could bestow immortality or lead us to spiritual liberation. As I dove deeper and deeper into my research, I found myself continuing to wonder how and why did a prominent feature of yoga philosophy and praxis become eclipsed within the modern era? What circumstances influenced such a dramatic displacement of a central and consistent characteristic of yoga philosophy and practice? To answer these questions, I wanted to offer you a timeline to give you a framing of the changing conceptions of breath and prana. In the Vedic era, the breath was related to the sacrificial fire, to the reciting of the mantra. The Vedic ritual was intended to uphold the cosmic order, and the reciting of the hem required the lengthening of the breath, which was an initial step in breath control. It was the elite Brahmana class, the male members, who had the authority and thus the power to conduct the ritual. During the early Upanishads, or the Upanishadic era, ideas were substantially transforming. The role of the priest was being decentered as the Vedic rituals, the external rituals, were being internalized, and the breath was a key component in this process. For the breath was seen to be an embodiment of Brahman, or ultimate reality, and prana was its active principle. Carried by the wind of the breath, prana was seen to be a bridge to the unchanging unified field of consciousness. Within the classical era, the breath became a support within the progressive limb systems. It was a means to control the mind, and during this time, there were many different limb systems. However, Patanjali's 8-limbed or Ashtanga yoga is probably the one most recognized today. At the end of the classical era and at the start of the medieval era was a time that was marked with political instability. The regional powers were increasing, and this elevated the role of the guru over institutional authorities. During this period was the proliferation of Hatha Yoga, and the role of the breath widely expanded. In 1498, an oversea passage from Portugal opened up the Indian subcontinent to European colonial rule. The Europeans viewed the Hatha yogis as offensive and threatening, and the scholars of Sanskrit literature known as the Orientalists, they preferred or favored the philosophical or the intellectual pursuits of Samkhya and Vedanta. All of these factors contributed to the downfall of Hatha Yoga. Today, within modern yoga, breath practices are often absent or irrelevant. And within that, we are now going to take a look at a few of the different attributes of the various eras, starting with the Vedic and early Upanishadic conceptions. During the Vedic era, aspects of the natural world were honored and worshipped, and the Upanishads amplified these ideas. Both the sun and the wind were glorified and became external symbols representing prana and breath, respectively. These early thinkers were observing the rhythms of the natural world, and they were making correlations to the rhythms of human respiration. They worshiped the wind as a deity and called it Vatu or Vayu. And they realized that within the human container, there was a limitation with the breath, but they were aware of its potential. If they could control what was naturally unrestrained, then they could extend life or attain immortality. Samkhya is one of the 6 orthodox schools of Indian philosophy. It is, oh my goodness, I'm having a moment here, so sorry. Pardon me. It is in contrast to the Upanishadic non-dualistic version of prana that I was just presenting. Samkhya is a dualistic school, and the attitude towards prana starts to substantially change. It becomes much more pragmatic. The ideas, Samkhyan ideas, can be traced back to the late Vedic era. However, the oldest text that we know of today is the Samkhya Karika, and it was thought to be written sometime between the 4th and 5th centuries, making it a contemporary of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. The activity, let me back that up. The clicker seems to be a little delayed.
Point the computer.
At the computer. Which computer? There's so many. There's nothing happening. Okay, got it. Thank you. Prana is mentioned one time within the text. Verse 29 is highlighting the relationship. That's weird. It's showing up here. Okay, it's just very delayed. It's highlighting the relationship between the Antakarana and the 5-fold function principle prana. The Antakarana is the inner instrument. Oh my goodness gracious, what is happening? The Antakarana is the inner instrument, and it consists of 3 different aspects. So sorry. It's just really tragic. No attack, that's right. Okay, here we go. The 3 aspects of the Antakarana or the inner instrument. The buddhi, which is sometimes referred to as the higher mind. This is our ability to discern and to judge. The ahamkara, which translates to the eye maker. This is our sense of being a separate self, our external identity, or our ego sense. And manas, the outer thinking mind, which is interrelated to our 5 senses of perception. These 3 aspects of the inner instrument are, I am having just tech problem after tech problem. Each have their own unique characteristics, but they share the guiding common function of the vital airs. Each of these 5 winds has its own unique function, but they flow and unify. Rather than being different airs, they are different functions of the one principal prana. The 5 vayus regulate the biological body and allow the physical mechanisms to function with the subtle inner faculties as a cohesive whole. In other words, the physiological and psychological faculties are unified through the vital airs. The 5 vital airs are influencing our ability to translate information into comprehensive knowledge. Thus, their disorder can lead to both physiological and psychological imbalances. It just keeps getting better. I'm not sure why it's not responding. Oh, I see. I'll just get it. Okay. The Yoga Sutra of Patanjali is perhaps one of the most important and well-known texts within the yoga tradition. It is based upon the metaphysics of Samkhya, and it has been suggested that Patanjali applied a system of practices to realize Samkhya's aim. In the previous slide, we heard Samkhya call the inner instrument the Antakarana. Patanjali refers to it as the chitta. Within the second verse of the text, Patanjali offers his definition of yoga. Chitta vritti narodaha. Yoga is the stilling of the fluctuations of the mind. Yoga is the stilling of the activity of the buddhi, the ahamkara, and manas. Yeah. Oh, no. Sorry, there should be little things, icons that come up. Thus, the Karika is giving us is explaining the relationship between the inner instrument. No. No, that's okay. The Karika was explaining the relationship between the inner instrument and prana, whereas Patanjali is applying technique to generate an outcome. Thus, the interconnection between the breath and the mind has advanced, as the breath is recognized as a way to calm mental activity. By controlling prana through breath techniques, the outward-facing senses are drawn inwards, a necessary prerequisite for the higher limbs of the system to be realized. Within Patanjali's system, the breath is folded into a larger framework. It plays an intermediate role within the system as it's placed forth within the 8 limbs. Now, the accounts of aesthetic breath control had been happening for a long time, back to the Upanishadic era. But they were spoken of generally in a more general sense, rather than giving specific instructions. Patanjali does offer some guidelines, some instructions about the breath, but the instructions are terse, and this is because the nature of a sutra, its characteristic is to be a concise statement packed with maximum meaning for memorization's sake. Thus, the texts say one would need further clarification from an authoritative text, or excuse me, an authoritative source. We would need a guru to unpack the meaning of the sutra. Nonetheless, according to Patanjali, pranayama is accomplished when one attains Kevala Kumbhaka, the breath technique that Dana was just speaking about. This is the spontaneous breath retention, in which the motion of the lungs stop, but the yogi continues to live due to the internal flow of prana maintaining the body. Now, as extraordinary as this may sound to us today, this was a standard account throughout the ascetic yoga traditions. Okay, let's see if we can make this happen. It's so weird. Okay, within Hatha Yoga, Hatha Yoga maintained metaphysical elements of Samkhya, but folded it into a non-dualistic philosophy stemming from Vedantic and Tantric teachings. It expanded upon the tantric concepts of the subtle body, giving particular importance to a powerful spiritual energy called Kundalini. However, the text emphasized that both the physical and subtle bodies must be purified for this pursuit to be successful. Otherwise, it could be detrimental to the yogi. As the dangers of incorrect pranayama practice had been accounted for long before Hatha Yoga, the Hatha Yogis developed a system of breath techniques, Nadi Shuddhi, to purify or cleanse the physical and subtle bodies in preparation for the advanced pranayama techniques. There were many models of the subtle body. And however, most agree that it was made of a vast network of subtle energy channels. Again, what Dana was speaking about in her presentation. These channels were known as nadis, in which the prana flowed through. Over time, 3 became the most important. Ida sits to the left, referring to the left nostril. It is related to the moon and has the predominance of tamas, which is the quality of inertia and has a concealing nature. Pingala sits to the right. It is related to the sun and has the predominance of rajas, which is the quality of activity and has a dynamic nature. Sushumna was the central or is the central channel, and it is the primary nadi. The goal was to weave the polarities of the sun and the moon, of rajas and tamas. For it is due to their polarizing nature that we experience the world in its multiplicity and relate to the world in terms of oppositional distinctions, such as hot and cold, attraction and aversion. The text states that through breath control, prana enters the central channel. Time and causality are consumed, and the perception of duality collapses. The need for a guru is stated throughout the textual tradition. One heavy with knowledge was needed to provide context and to clarify the teachings to the student. The disciples' dedication determined their worthiness as a guardian of knowledge, Ayana Rakshaka. The European legacy of colonial rule in India changed the way that yoga was practiced, perceived, and passed on. The teacher-student transmission was severely damaged due to the divide and conquer tactics of European colonialism. It was within this atmosphere during the late 19th century that yoga began to be reformed. Most likely, if you practice yoga today, you've been influenced by one, if not all 3 of these early modern teachers, even if that's by degrees of separation. Vivekananda favored the intellectual philosophies while distancing himself from Hatha Yoga. He presented a neo-Vedantic model of prana in his influential book, Raja Yoga. He speaks of prana through a unitive and intellectual lens, but he never offers a technique of how to still prana, even though he indicates that it's possible that we can do so. Shivananda was also a neo-Vedantin and shared similar language to Vivekananda with describing prana. Even within the few decades that separated Vivekananda and Shivananda, there were significant shifts in attitudes towards physical practices of yoga and physical cultural more broadly. Shivananda promoted an integral approach to yoga, which included Hatha Yoga and thus pranayama. Krishnamacharya was perhaps the greatest influencer within the scope of postural practice. However, he was a full-blown yogi, highly educated in all of the Indian philosophies, as well as embodied within the subtle practices, including pranayama. His book, Yoga Makaranda Part 1, leaves the impression that he seemed to be quite disheartened that his compatriots had succumbed to Western influences and had abandoned their holistic practices of yoga and Ayurveda. He speaks of pranayama in the text and says he'll come back to it later. It's unclear why he never does. Perhaps he felt that asana was just a more appropriate practice for the changing trends in society. With so much change, disruption, and bigotry caused by European colonial influence, as well as the need to adapt, reform, and yoga for the empirically minded Western audience, it is of little surprise that the practice of pranayama became incidental in modern transnational yoga. We're going to get through this, I promise you, one little step at a time. I presented the conceptions of breath and prana through both dualistic and non-dualistic trends of yoga philosophy. When considering a philosophy of the breath through the framework of duality versus non-duality, the non-dual perspective of yoga would be all-inclusive, but it runs the risk of losing individuality, and thus the sensitivity to the fact that a lack of equity exists amongst peoples, systems, and non-human life, including the planet. The dualistic perspective recognizes plurality, there we go, but misses the unitive perspective, which anchors us from being swept away by the tides of polarity. We enter into our body and onto this planet through our individual breath. When our time comes to an end, we depart with our final exhale. Every breath in between is shared in relationship with others and our environment. The value of a vision of the breath as both individual as well as shared is that it recognizes the unique story of each individual, yet the shared breath reminds us that we coexist with the world around us. The breath holds the potential to acknowledge both multiplicity and commonality, origin and apotheoses. The importance of the breath has been obscured in much of modern approach to yoga, but we can revitalize its role one conscious breath at a time. May your life breath reveal your inherent potential. Thank you so much.